This ZeroNow program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
I can't be protected by hopes and prayers.
I won't use hope towards what's next. I'll make my own way.
I know impossible is an opinion.
I won't wait for safer schools. I want to create them.
I don't want to be afraid anymore.
I refuse to be a victim.
I'm just one person.
Determined
To bring us back to zero.
I'm just one person.
Determined
To bring us back to zero.
I am just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
Well, good morning, Guy, and thank you for coming on today. Let's start a little bit about your background in public safety.
Well, I started basically when in safety and security when I was in the United States Army for several years, and when I got out of the military, when I went to college, or I was trying to expand my education, I got into school K-12 security, basically running the after-hours events for a private security company. That was what I did to help pay for college and things like that. But what I found was when I was doing that I was, a 21-year-old young man at the time, and I'm going, wow, this is pretty cool. What I'm doing here is just something to aspire for the future. So when I did that, it started out with after school events and, coordinating, the security and the emergency preparedness for the after hours, like school dances, football games, soccer games, athletic events and things like that. And then that's what got me started. And then I went into, when I moved to Denver, I was looking for a position, and I decided to apply for a school safety job in 1989. In Littleton, Colorado, and thankfully I was able to obtain that position. But I will say, when we look back at 1989, 1990, it's such a different time. If we're looking at school safety and the evolution and the types of where we were then, and where we are now is completely different. There was, if anything, I can say, it was quite. Becoming a security director through those years and working, being a security director before there was really a lot of security directors. There wasn't a lot of school security in the 80s and the 90s and things. I mean, there was some, but it was a different time, so to say. And I can say, going through my career, is watching the evolution of school safety over the last 30 plus, 35 years has been pretty darn interesting. If I could say to you and everybody, it's just, where we were then is completely different where we are now. It's more, I look at the types of things that we had dealt with in the 1980s and the 1990s was a lot of like property crime, protecting the campuses 24/7 to make sure there wasn't thefts, and there was a lot of those things because we didn't have the security technology and the things we had now. But back in those days, that was probably, was property protection and, student management, but, and things like that. But it was not the same as where we are now. And so there was an evolution. I can say, we look at Columbine in 1999, but there was an evolution of, what expectation for people like myself and, what we did. We had to, basically we went from certain hazards focus to an all hazards sense, probably, smack dab right there at the turn of the century, is what my interpretation is. And it became an all hazards type of expectation and for us to deploy life safety components, and it's a constant evolution since then, so like I said, dramatic changes. Now, what I say, we're talking, we talk about at ZeroNow a lot about, school shootings and things, but what I'm also saying, going way beyond that, it became mental health, it became all hazards, like, being prepared for weather emergencies or, gas leaks, things. We just had to be prepared for an all hazards type of sense. What goes on in schools goes on in the communities. They reflect each other. And I think that's important to realize, as a school safety professional, you're dealing with many different things. So when I look at things where we are now, like I said, it's a lot different. And it's something that I think that being a security director, one of those things that really propelled me through my career was the change, and you had to adapt, you had to prepare, you had to do your different things. And I think I kind of enjoyed that. I enjoyed the helping people, and I enjoyed, the constant challenges. It was not especially when we get later into like 2005 and beyond, in my career, it was a dramatic change. You just never knew what the day would bring you. Every day was an adventure, and a night was an adventure.
So thank you. There's a lot there, but I think that where I want to focus right now is you started as a school safety director in 1989, and
Well, actually, I started out as a security officer. So
okay,
they did not
security.
have a lot of security directors in those days. Now, and what a security officer back in the 1980s, a lot of times what they would, either they'd probably focused on campus security, or in the tech, or in somebody like myself from the district level, we would be focused on security monitoring and automation monitoring and things based, the technology that was out there at the time was, we look at like Honeywell or, Delta 1000 systems. A lot of school districts, some school districts that did have those types of systems would hire folks like myself as security personnel to work and operate those systems, monitor them.
Well, what I want to talk about is, so in 1999 is when Columbine happened in Littleton, Colorado, which I believe is where you were working at the time. So when that happened, did you what was the shift like in your role?
Well, let's just say, when I look at that role, as I was saying before, like the 1980s and the 1990s, there was a lot of focus on property crime and things, protecting the assets of the school district from losses, like burglars and things. But when we look at 1999, it was a very shocking incident. And what happened was that focus, it changed the whole focus for us in K through 12, especially so, those of us with existing in security, that we were, it's something that we never saw before, even though there was school violence before. But that, when we look at that incident, you never saw anything like that before in your life. You never saw an attack, a siege. It was like a siege, if that makes sense. And you're sitting there, and for me in my brain, and for others, you knew when you saw that incident arising that your whole career, your whole focus is going to change. And you knew it at that immediately, within probably hours after that event, that everything of what you're doing is going to, everything that you do in your work is going to change from that moment going forward. And I think that when I look at that, that was a call to folks like myself that, all right, we're going to need to adapt. We're going to need to analyze. We're going to need to look at everything possible to build a holistic security, solutions into our school district. But also, too, how do we do that without creating a fear mentality, or creating, things that contradict, what we are supposed to be doing as educators, which is empowering the students to learn to the best of their abilities, the teachers to teach to their best abilities, but also that expectation of us to protect their loved ones who are attending school and learning and teaching and working in the schools. And when you look at it that way, that's the big broadside. But also, too, the changes that came from that day were, you look back about how you did incident command was huge, how you did threat assessments, what would cause a situation like this. Those are things that you never really discussed prior to that. Like, the potential for school violence, the threat assessments. And those were things that were very infantile or not even existing at that time. And we look at like technology implementations in school districts in 1999. You look at, hardly any schools had cameras. Most schools did not have access control. Most schools did not, many schools did not practice active threat drills. It's just a complete change. And that did foster a complete change for us in K through 12 safety and security was that event in that time.
Right.
And it was eye-opening. And I think that, you look at it in that tragedy in your community and how it impacts and things every day, you got to get back to normal. And I think the new normalcy was an expectation for school districts to do something to protect their facilities. Think about this, back in 1999, let's say 10 days, a school day before 10 days before Columbine happened. Okay. I'd go to a school. Anybody would go to a school pretty much in many places. Every darn door in that school would be unlocked. Does that make sense? Like every exterior door. Anybody could walk up to a school, go into any side door pretty much, and walk into a school. And that was a big change that also, it just basically made people start looking at the different threats that could arise in the school and for us to come up with things to address these things that we never really even thought about before.
Right. And in addition to things like that, security of the building, I imagine that there were a lot of changes in protocol with actual students. And one of the things that comes to mind was the advent of the school lockdown drill, where we simulate an intruder in the building, everybody hides, teachers lock the doors, we close the blinds, etc. Now, in your role, in addition to making sure that the safety and welfare of the students is protected, I imagine that you also dealt with the mental health of students. So I'm curious about that intersection, something like a lockdown drill with the mental health component. Do you feel like the trade-off was worth it?
Well, if you attended my last interview, I might have said something that was controversial to some, and I say this. I've always looked at lockdown drills and students as being a part of the team, if that makes sense. It's like a student to me has always been somebody, just like any employee, you respect them. They're there especially when you're looking at age appropriateness. So for me, it's always been a challenge is because I've always wanted to see students more included in emergency preparedness, because I've always looked at a young person with their developmental levels, where they are, like, a fifth grader can understand first aid components. Definitely in middle school, high school age kids can understand how to lock a door. And those things always bothered me in my career because I always felt like we were leaving out the students. So I would say to you and anybody else that, if you looked at my career, as I always looked at how can I empower others has always been the thing. So what I'm also saying to you, there was never a standard solution from school district to school district. Like what I'm saying to you would be considered controversial by some is, well, what do you mean by empowering students? And so I could say to you from like 2000 to 2010, there were, for somebody like myself, we realized that, okay, where are we? We got all this. We're putting this wonderful technology into our schools. When we're looking at that from that time, we also, if you're doing this for a long time, you realize too how important mental health is. And the correspondence of, when we're looking at human behavior, it's about, how are we going to basically redirect negative behavior? How are we going to empower people to put those things aside? And so what I would say to you in the 2000s to 2010s, I was dealing probably 30, 40, involved with probably 30 to 40 typical mental health situations a year where, as a response or getting help for some people. But later on in my career, in like 2010 and beyond, it was 700 a year for, myself and our teams were responding to these things. And where is the dramatic change? I think that the need was always there. Okay, is what I'm trying to say. It was always there. But what we did is we were forced, or, we had to force and focus because we started to realize that, and that's still going on right now. That's my perception, is we've been hardening our buildings, but have school districts been looking at getting to the detection before a person does harm to a school or does harm to a community or harm to others. And what we're seeing is, or to themselves. Let's not forget, we have a suicide problem. We've always had a suicide problem for teenagers in this country. And coming from where I am now in Wyoming and Colorado, our suicide rate is twice the suicide rate of other states, where, when we look at that. But when we look at that, the correlation of mental health is something that was kind of like a new frontier. I hate to say it, and it was something that everybody thought we could solve mental health issues with just ignoring it or putting in other measures. So when we look at like what your question was going to the drills and things, what I'm saying is my experience and seeing things was school districts that were focused on holistically applying that and realizing that their students and their staff were part of the situation for a positive outcome. I think that what we learned to do that was to realize that students and were just as important as myself in that equation, because of their actions could also save others. And I can say that to anybody, and I'm proud of that. That's my observation. I've seen many, we look at Safe to Tell, we look at, like Colorado for, notification. I mean, that system down there in Colorado and Wyoming, or, those notification sites, it's not squealing, but if they have a friend or somebody or classmate that is expressing that they want to do self-harm or harm others, well, you're not typically not going to detect that with the staff or the community. You're going to detect that with their fellow students. But what I would also say to anybody else is looking at when we do those interventions, we're not looking to destroy a person's life. We're looking to intervene and get them onto a better course. That's our course, is to, responsible adults eventually when they get out of school and go on to secondary education or employment and things. And we look at that is the drills and all that. If we just look at drills as something that we're going to go and do unannounced and scare the bejesus out of everybody every day, we're not doing anything. All we're doing is creating fear. But when we use these opportunities for education, that's where we win at, and when we empower people to respond. That's huge.
So it sounds like what you're saying, that in order to get people to open up about their mental health struggles, they need to trust you. And that comes from a variety of different places, but with something like a lockdown drill, if it happens unannounced and it scares everybody, and if it fosters anxiety in people, well, the people who are responsible for that drill, they're not going to become part of the people that they trust when it comes to having to open up about a mental health circumstance. So it sounds like all of these things are
They're
related.
all related. You look at schools, every action that we do, when we look at safety and security, it will have an impact. And you got to look at that impact. What is that impact? Is it going to be positive? Is it going to be a negative? Even when you have a positive impact, you're always going to have a negative. There's always going to be another side to something. And I think that's important. But what I found in my observation is when instead of fear, okay, now you're going to have fear even when you announce things, okay, because people are going to be thinking about that. But when you're doing drills and things, you're walking people through that drill. But you're also giving them a basic, we hear that terminology, options-based lockdown, or like run, hide, fight, and things like that. But I would challenge people to say, too, when they talk run, hide, fight, so to say, well, why aren't you adding a care component into that? Like, stop the bleed, first aid, psychological first aid. Because the observation, I'm not, in Columbine, I was not in Columbine directly, but in the Arapahoe shooting, yeah, I was the district's incident coordinator. And one of those things is, when I look at that, is how do we empower people? And that's what I saw was students there was leaders. Does that make sense? Like there was leaders that when those situations arose, that where other students were drawn to for help and things like that. And what I saw was, well, what was the commonality of those people in those situations? Well, they were empowered individuals. They were empowered by, they took some trainings that we did, or their parents or somebody talked to them prior about this situation. The school resource officers gave them briefings. School security department gave them training over time. But where I'm going with that was those were people that paid attention. But also, too, when the worst happened, they were the leaders in those situations. But you can't get there without education, if that makes sense. I'm not talking ABCs, but you can't get there to you're 99.9%. If you're going to empower somebody to be able to handle an to handle a situation, you got to educate them. So I say thank God, and I emphasize that. We have, unfortunately, we have several active shooter incidents a year. Okay, but think about this: when we look at how many heart attacks, how many drug overdoses, how many suicides, how many things that we have. But let's say when we empower a student, you're not only empowering them at school, you're empowering them at home or out in the community. And when one of those things is like over my career is always like to see school safety departments bring like American Red Cross protocols into their school district so they can train people on universal precautions and first aid, but also too, including the students when they're sixth graders and seventh graders, you're eligible to get your first aid card and opening up your first aid training to your students. And I can say to you in my career, I don't know how my old district's doing it now, but it was always a wonderful thing when a young person came up and said, and you heard the story that grandpa had a heart attack and that summer, and the daughter or granddaughter gave her CPR, if that makes sense, or somebody was choking. So you look at that like, okay, I'm training these people for active threat incidents in schools, but I'm also training them for all hazards that they might run in their life. So where I look at it, here I am, I'm an educator as a school safety professional. I'm not teaching them the ABCs, but I'm teaching them some life skills that might be very helpful. And I also think, I look at like my own son when I moved here in in 2020, the first week or two, he's, how young people are struggling to make friends when they move somewhere and go and meet new people. But in this little town, we had a shooting where a cop and a suspect out in the community started shooting at each other outside the movie theater. And that's something that never happens here. But then here's my son who been through our active threat training and things like that. He's able to take charge and help the other young people he's with steer clear of the situation and understand that, you don't go towards that, you're going to go away. And that's what they did. And then they did it tactically. But it just impressed me because, okay, these things are not things that happen in the schools, okay, but there's the things that happened out in the communities, and these people were empowered by what we did.
So you've mentioned this idea of empowering students a lot, and I'm curious about how exactly you went about that, because some of the people who are listening maybe are people who will step into a role like the one that you were in, and they might be wondering, well, I want to empower my students, but how do I do that? So what were your strategies and techniques?
Well, first of all, when I looked at in my career, looking at it was finding out resources like through the National Association of School Psychologists, or later on after Sandy Hook, for example, Safe and Sound Schools with Michelle Gray's group, and looking at like Safe and Sound Schools and the developmental levels of safety and security awareness. They have that material out there for you. And looking at that and taking that comprehensive material and bringing it to your team. It's all about creating teams in school districts. When you create a safe buildings team, for example, every school in a school district should have its own safe building team, and the district should have its district safety committee, whatever you're going to call it. But what it is the district level has their team members that oversee, they'll have a discussion on implementations of life safety components in your schools, and then in your schools you have an incident command teams, and that's something I have always found to be very valuable as a school. In my career, we had that when Columbine happened. Okay. And it was very helpful for us to have some type of incident command. And many of us, or many of our school district, in after Columbine, were doing incident command over training in Virginia in 2001 for school districts. But where I'm going with this is what I just brought up is creating a team. Now, what we've looked at, what we've learned too in those teams is, especially when we look at a safe buildings team is having student input and things onto that safe buildings team, so they can understand, the individual representing the student environment, or the students out there can also understand the implementations that we're doing there, but also getting that support too about how we're going to do that training. So it's about creating partnerships, and those partnerships were important. So like the American Red Cross, that was a huge one. And I say to any school district that is not partnering with the American Red Cross, you should be doing that. And why I say that, we look at every given day. You look at a school district, if you have 15 schools, I guarantee you in your school district or more, you're probably going to have 3 or 4 or 5 medical calls a day coming to your schools. Okay. And, you're going to have a kid that's going to have an epileptic attack, staff member, somebody falls off a jungle gym. There's injuries all the time in schools, and we need to prepare people for that, what first aid is. So what that partnership with the American Red Cross was huge, because what we were able to do was bring the very low cost universal precaution training in first aid, but eventually too, things like bringing in their pillowcase program, and they're prepared, or their responder. Like my wife's a school psychologist up here, and she just attended an American Red Cross training on psychological first aid and things for staff members. But where those trainings are available to everybody. And I think that's important, because when we give those, when you give an opportunity that doesn't cost anything, like, for example, kids are, I don't have a lot of money. Kids don't have a lot of money. We're sitting there charging them $70 for a course or something like that. It's going to be hard for that kid to come in. So things like, what was really cool about the American Red Cross, let's say the kid didn't have the money to get his certificate. Well, we can let him go through the training, right? What's the problem with letting him go through the training and things like that? And I love the fact the American Red Cross didn't have a problem with that. Okay, we'll let him in there, because what we're doing is empowering him. Maybe he doesn't have that money, but but eventually he could get that. He or she could get that money and get their certificate if it was important. Or maybe I could help them if they really needed it for their employee, because it was really cool too. Is when we had kids come to us and, had an employee that maybe they were going to be a lifeguard that summer, or they took a daycare job, or they were doing babysitting, and the client wanted them, to have that certification. It was just about working with them, because what we just did too is we empowered them for school, but we also empowered them for outside, but also too to gain employment and things like that. And it was a win-win. And I loved it, because when somebody came back and would tell us about what happened, over the summer, or on a Saturday night, that they saved somebody's life, that was just, gave you darn chills, I mean, because, okay, you just helped somebody who did a really good thing and saved somebody else's life or helped them. And I looked at that as important. So that partnerships was very good. And there was other partnerships that, one could develop, and what it's all about today, I don't like to use that takes a village and things, but we look at what we look at today is in school, especially around threat assessment, is help is not just in the school, it's a community effort. When somebody's out planning violence and things like that, we're working with the resources in the community and things for the best interest of the school and that person that is calling out for help or needs that help. So it's all about partnerships. So what we are seeing now is removal of silos, which is good, because that also increases the communication interoperability, but also too the services that we can bring to victims or people that need help at this time. That's what's so important. So that's what I see. Is I see a world where we are more open. Is when we close that world is when we get in trouble.
Yeah, I think those are really actionable, interesting steps that you took and clearly saw worked, and then other people who continue to hold the mantle of helping students and empowering students can use. So thank you so much for taking the time today, Guy. And
well, look at what you're doing right now. You probably do many interviews for ZeroNow. Okay, and you're obviously a young person. My thought is, you guys are the future. Okay. But, one of the things that I want to say, we live, our country is probably one of the freest in the world. Okay. And what we do,
amen to that.
And thank God it is. Okay. Because, we have diversity, and diversity is important. So when I look at that is folks like yourself or old timers like myself, we maintain that freedom of, we're, when we keep our voices out there, we keep that diversity, but also too, more voices means more positive change. When it's focused on just one or two individuals or, a political leader, we know we don't get anywhere. So it's all about all of us. And this is an important endeavor. So thank you for what you're doing, Michael.
Yes. And thank you, Guy. Thank you.